So good morning, everyone. My name is Lacey Villava. I'm the education manager here at Gunston Hall, and I am so excited to be joined this morning by Laura Hallwood, who's in our other kitchen here at Gunston Hall. And we also have one of our volunteers joining us, I'm so sorry, Rachel. Rachel Anderson, who's joining us virtually, who will bounce in her comments and thoughts throughout the morning as well.
My mom, my name was almost Rebecca, so you're.
Perfect. So we are going to get started. We're very excited this morning to be bringing to you some recipes that were made by people who were enslaved, possibly here at Gunston Hall, definitely things that we know people were making in the 18th century. So Laura's going to do the main part of the cooking. She's going to do a cooked greens recipe for us this morning. And if we have time, I'll be making some peanut butter here in the kitchen with you as well. So Laura, I'm going to turn it over to you to get started.
Thank you. So good morning, everyone. I have my setup here and we're trying something new today. So hopefully this will work out. So we'd love to have feedback from you on our new camera setup. So today, we're making greens. So last week, if you joined us for that, we focused almost entirely on the Mason family and this group of social elites. But this week we want to focus on the group of people that were making that food for the Masons. So enslaved people, and enslaved people obviously had a far more limited, had a far more limited availability of food. So what we want to look at too, though, is that the way that enslaved people put together their palate was very different than how wealthy European colonists did. So in West Africa, greens are actually a really important part of their diet, and often they were stewed with different kinds of meat and vegetables. And here in the English colonies, enslaved workers who'd been brought from Africa to Virginia, they keep eating these greens, but they have to readjust the way that they're preparing them because they don't have all the different ingredients on hand that they would have in where they came from. So today we're going to be looking at one of these recipes. Now, we don't have the same kind of written recipe that we had last week. Last week we had recipes that were published, things that were written in people's family recipe books, but for many enslaved workers who were often illiterate, they don't have the same kind of records for these recipes. So instead they get handed down orally. So one mother teaches her daughter or her nieces and nephews, and so this is spread in a much more informal way. However, there's a lot of similarities between this African-American cuisine and African cuisine. And so fortunately for us, people have studied this, and a woman named Jessica Harris actually published a book about it called Iron Pots and Wooden Spoons. Highly recommend it if you're interested in the subject. And that's the recipe we're using today, is Miss Harris's recipe. Now, she wrote a very large recipe that called for 4 pounds of mixed greens. We have sized that down, so we're going to use 4 cups of mixed greens. So behind me, I have our greens, and I have some of them. Here we go. I'll hold it up so you can see. They are unshredded now. And we have a mixture. They're from our garden here at Gunston Hall. So we're really fortunate that we actually have a garden we can pull things from. And we've got a mixture of turnips, kale, and collard greens. In the period, beet greens would also have been used. And the great thing about using greens from turnips and beets is that that is a double whammy. You're going to get not only the greens, but also the root vegetable from that one crop. So the first thing we need to do is wash them. I've already had these washed, so they're ready to go, but we want to tear them up a little bit so that way when they cook, they're nice small bits and no one reaches in and gets an entire leaf. So I have some of them already shredded, but I'm going to finish shredding this bit. And
while Laura's working on shredding those, I have some fun thoughts to share. We've been doing research with the household accounts that we can find of other museums, and recently I've been spending a lot of time with the household accounts from Monticello, in which people who were enslaved are actually, they're growing things in their garden, they're raising chickens, and they're selling things to the Jefferson family. And one of the things that I have seen very frequently in the summer and fall months is what they describe as a mess of greens. And a mess of greens to me is just, it's kind of a bunch of stuff. If you heard the words a mess of greens, what would you think they were? If you have some thoughts, go ahead, type them in the chat, shout them out. We're curious about what your thoughts about what a mess of greens is. Arlene says a variety of greens, absolutely.
Yeah, I would wonder if it was a variety versus a measurement.
Right, yeah, so there's that too, a measurement versus a variety. Anybody have any other thoughts? Some to cook, perfect, yeah, absolutely. We're seeing a few thoughts in the chat.
What was the spinach pie? What was the measurement of the spinach?
4 pounds of spinach in one spinach pie.
When we made that spinach pie, the recipe Laura found, it was something weird.
I'm trying to remember. I'll have to look it up. We'll find it. Laura, Rachel, if you get a chance, you can look it up and tell us. We've got some other thoughts. We've got in the chat from Donna, an overabundance. From Lori, cleaning out the garden. From Eric and Nicole, the leaves of whatever crop you harvested. And somebody else does mention in the comments that we do still say a mess of greens today, and that's absolutely a term that we use. This one is really fascinating to me. I think in the Jefferson household accounts, they're actually talking about a measurement, that it's definitely mixed, but that they're also talking about a specific amount of greens, because every time I see the mess of greens listed in this inventory, it's valued at the same amount. It's always 9 pence. I know that they can get, for a dozen eggs, they're gonna get 9 pence. For a mess of greens, they're gonna get 9 pence. For a dozen cucumbers, they're going to get 6 pence. So there's this, I think it's also, it's both talking about a mixture of greens, and it's talking about a specific size of greens. Because when there's lettuce in there, the lettuce does get separated from the greens. You'll get a mess of greens and lettuce, not just a mess of greens.
How is the lettuce measured?
It's not indicated. I think that's really fascinating. And I'm doing more research to see if we can figure out if there's a kind of frequency to this in what they're growing. I think based on what I've determined that there's some pooling of resources going on, because we see 1 or 2 people coming back again and again and again with like 7 dozen eggs.
So,
and for those of you who keep chickens, you might know that chickens only produce 1 egg a day. So over the course of a week, if you have 1 chicken, you would get 7 eggs. But to get 7 dozen eggs, you've got to have a lot more chickens. But I see some other great thoughts about what things could be in here in our mess of greens. Wild greens, garden herbs like parsley, oregano, greens from the root vegetables, absolutely. We think that people who were enslaved here at Gunston Hall, at Monticello, at other places here in Virginia, were growing all of these things, and they were using it to feed themselves, but they were also using it to feed their families and to sell back to the families that held their lives, basically.
I'm going to interject for just a moment because I'm
about to say, are you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready. So I have all of my greens shredded now. So ta-da, beautiful. And so our next ingredient is some nice pork. So we've got, ta-da, whoop, there we go, some beautiful salt pork, and we've cut ours up. You could also use bacon if that's what you have on hand. And the reason that we're using salt pork is that salt pork was something that was included in rations for enslaved workers. Enslaved workers.
How much salt pork are we putting in?
We are putting in 2 tablespoons, although I think this looks like a kind of a heavy 2 tablespoons.
I didn't measure when I cut it, sorry.
It's totally fine. And to be honest, you know, it's up to your discretion. And that's one of the things about recipes like this that are adapted from non-written down sources is a lot of times they're very flexible. This is not a hard and fast, this is not like baking where you need to have exactly the right chemical balance or your cake will not come out right. This is a lot about personal preference and flavor and what you have on hand. But when it comes to rations, enslaved people were issued essentially usually cornmeal and salted fish. And salted pork was something that was sometimes included in their ration, but not all the time. And sometimes it was included at Christmas. Other times it was bartered for. So we just talked about the Jeffersons purchasing or bartering different supplies from enslaved workers. And in return, they could receive things like extra rations of pork. But salt pork was incredibly common in colonial Virginia. It's one of the most popular kinds of meat, so that's what we're using. Now, in Harris's recipe, she actually uses bacon and a ham hock, and we are sizing that down to just using the salt pork. But it begs the question, do you put in your meat before or after your greens? And I belong to the group of people who likes to put mine in first, partially because I like it to cook a little longer. I like my small pieces of pork to be a little bit crispy, but you could always put it in a little bit after your greens. So I'm gonna put that on in, and then I'm gonna give it a stir. That way it spreads out. I already had started heating up my pot because my stove is a little slow to start. But there's no hurry on this. This is very much a low and slow dish. So if you don't finish it by the time I'm done with this morning, that's okay. Leave it on the stovetop. Let it continue to happily simmer along. One of the things about enslaved cooking that we know is that many people who are enslaved can't be right there watching their dishes all the time. And so what they would do is have these kinds of meals that they could prepare in a pot and let it sit for a long period of time and come back to it later. And then they would have something ready. Yes.
We've got a question. Did you add any oil to the pot first?
I have not added any oil to the pot. However, if you are going to use a vegetarian substitute, so if you don't want to use pork for whatever reason, you can use oil and a little bit of a vegetable bouillon cube. So in that case, yeah, go ahead and use oil. Oil is totally fine. You just want something to lubricate the pan a little bit for you before you put your greens in.
And the salt pork does that naturally as it cooks down. The fat in the salt pork gets rendered down.
Yeah, like mine is already starting to kind of get a little shiny around the bottom of the pot. And I've got mine on a kind of medium-low heat, so mine's at a 4 on this particular stovetop. Because you don't want to burn it.
Cooking, Laura, we have a question.
Yeah.
And this is one for Laura and Rachel. I think you could answer this one as well. Do you feel that meat was used more as a flavoring since they didn't have much of it?
Ooh, it's definitely being used for flavor. And one of the things to consider is that some plantations included salt by itself as part of an enslaved person's ration, but not always. So this is a sometimes, not always thing. However, one of the major methods of preserving meat in the colonial period was salt. So if you were an enslaved person and you were getting a ration of salt fish, that whole fish is completely covered in salt. And you'd actually have to soak it before you ate it because you can't eat it when it's crusted over in salt entirely. So yeah, they are absolutely making use of the flavor that's already naturally there. And personally, I think greens taste better when they've been cooked with pork, but that's just me.
And yeah, same thing as cooking over as a tenant farmer. It's definitely the same thing, is that for tenant farmers or poor Virginians, it was the same thing where pork was your main meat. There was so much pork in colonial Virginia. But
so much. Like it's a little hard to overestimate how much pork was being used.
And so you would use it to flavor everything. I mean, you're flavoring your hoe cakes with pork fat. You're flavoring, I mean, everything it's a main flavor. And if you're poor, you can't afford spices, so you're going to use that.
Yeah,
for a lot of things.
And one thing to consider too is that, like, today, if you make bacon, you get all that grease that's left over. You can save that grease and use it later. So they would do things like that. where if you didn't use all of that bacon fat in one go, you would save it and then you could use it for other dishes later. And recipes from the period, recipe books talk about that. They actually call for those sorts of things.
Hey, Laura, I just wanted to give you a heads up. We've got about 10 minutes left. So I know your salt pork may not be quite there yet, but we may want to
Add my greens in. I was just thinking it was time. So we're about to do a magic trick, which is that all of this green is about to turn into something much smaller. So I am going to go ahead and put it on in. And it is better just to kind of take it handful by handful. If you try to dump it in all at once, you will miss the pot. Ask me how I know. So I like to do it a little bit and then give it a...
I think we missed the bowl in the pot last week, right?
Yes, we did.
I see lots of comments in the chat about uses for bacon grease and lard. They're great for pie crust, great for cooking other things. Bacon fat and lard are great for frying. You'll see lots of lard used in what we call soul food today, used for frying things. And both are rendered down, of course, from pig fat. So Laura, you're stirring that up to get the salt pork dispersed throughout, yeah?
Yeah, I'm kind of trying to distribute all of that fat that's, blazing along the bottom. And of course, I'm going to keep stirring it because the pork will keep cooking and it will keep releasing out that fat. Plus, I want to make sure that it's not just the stuff on the bottom getting cooked. I want to make sure that all the stuff on the top also gets a chance to be cooked.
Mm-hmm.
But as you cook, your greens will shrink down and it will become easier to make sure everything is very evenly cooked.
Right. And we're also going to add a little bit of water, right?
Yeah. And I'm going to do that in just a second. And to help me keep the heat of my pot up, I'm going to do a little bit at a time rather than adding a whole bunch all at once. But if your heat drops too much, you can just raise the heat of your stove top a little bit, just increase that heat. But it's just to help make sure things don't burn. Adding a little bit of water gives a little bit of cushion.
There's also quite a bit in Southern cooking and what becomes soul food in Southern American cooking that spawns out of cooking like this by people who were enslaved that relies on what they call pot liquor. And this is the liquid that's left over in the pot. It's really full of vitamins and minerals that cook out of the greens and into the liquid that Laura is adding to the pot. Pot liquor was used to make other ingredients and other foods. If you saw our Summer Saturdays program this summer where we made Kush, Kush was often made with pot liquor. We happened to make it with chicken stock because that was what we had on hand. But in the 18th century, during the lives of people who were enslaved, they would have used probably the pot liquor because chicken stock would have been something that they didn't have as much of.
It's just like in modern cookbooks today, we'll always tell you, save that water that you cooked your vegetables in.
Yeah. So it'll be about a cup of water that you would add in total. But like I said, I add mine a little bit at a time just to keep it from completely dousing my heat. And then after this, you can add salt and pepper to taste. So if you're using a particularly salty piece of pork, you may not want to add any salt whatsoever. However, if you've done a vegetarian substitute like oil, you may feel that a little salt, would be helpful. And pepper is one of those things that we know enslaved people were growing on their own. They had peppers that were actually brought from South America to Africa, the west coast of Africa, by the Portuguese very early on during the slave trade period. And then the African enslaved people were bringing them from West Africa to North America. And so they were growing peppers for flavor. And it's not just a singular kind of pepper, it's all sorts of peppers. But that's why things like barbecue today usually include pepper as a spice. They're homegrown, they're not expensive, they don't have to be imported like things such as nutmeg or cinnamon, which are very much spices of the wealthy elite.
And when we're talking about peppers, we're not talking about peppercorns, right, Laura? We're talking about things that we would recognize today in, say, Latin American and Hispanic foods, things like bird's eye peppers or habaneros or chipotle.
Peppers. Yeah.
They didn't necessarily have those varieties here in Virginia, but peppers do grow very well here in Virginia.
So I'm gonna lift up my pot real quick just to show you what this looks like.
So excited.
Because you'll see, wow, look how small that is compared to what we started with. So you can see it's really cooked down. Those greens have gone from being a great big fluffy pile to being a much smaller condensed pile.
Does anybody who is following along with us have any other thoughts or questions that they'd like to share with us? Feel free to shout them out if you'd like, or type them into the chat. We've got just a few minutes left before the end of the program today.
Any questions? I can't really read the chat from where I'm
No,
standing.
no worries. We haven't had any come through the chat. We have Nicole and Eric say that we're making them hungry. Me too. This is probably going to be part of my lunch. We have a great question about when the next session is, and I am super excited.
Yeah, we've been really enjoying doing this program, so we're really excited that you guys are asking us when the next program is. So we appreciate the enthusiasm. So our next one is not going to be next week. It'll actually be on Halloween. Same time, so 10:30 in the morning. And that week we're going to focus on tenant farmers. So what is the average Virginian who is not super wealthy eating?
And one of those answers is pumpkin. We're very, very excited. I'm so glad to hear, Laura, we have a comment in the chat about something that people can do with their family members who aren't in the same state. That's exactly what we're hoping that you guys will be able to do, is to have an opportunity to learn something new, try something new, and do it with somebody who isn't necessarily in the same room with you. I'm so excited that you guys are finding this as an opportunity for you to do that. So it looks like we didn't get to our peanuts today. So we had talked about making peanut butter, but we're not going to have enough time to get it done today. But you'll still have the recipe. It is on the website, and peanuts are also a really important part of 18th century cooking for enslaved Africans. Peanuts are also called ground nuts, actually came from Africa, and Western Europeans at the time were not eating them. They saw that the peanut, the ground nut, as food for animals, not for people. But people of African descent are using peanuts as this amazing flavoring agent and thickener in a lot of foods. So you guys have the recipe for peanut butter. You can make it, slab it on, put it on a slab of bread, on some crackers, but think about how they might have used it in the 18th century. This was something that they added to stews, added to soups. There's some really amazing dishes that use peanuts as a main ingredient, and they would make that peanut butter in a mortar and pestle and drop it into a stew as one of the final stages of cooking on that low and slow temperature that went on all day. So the recipes are on the website. Let me drop that in the chat again.
And I think the recipe, the crackle recipe does it have a temperature and a time? The crackles are 325 for 8 to 10 minutes, correct?
Are we talking about?
They asked about the crackle.
Oh, yes, the cracknel recipe is on the website already. The recording from last week's session, which had cracknels and drinking chocolate, the recording is not on, but the recipes and the ingredient lists are on the website for both last week's session and this week's session. So you can check those out. I just dropped the link for this week's session into the chat, so you can click on it direct there. I'll also try to get it sent out as a post-program link for everybody so you can revisit. But lastly, before we sign off for today, I do want to say thank you so much for participating today. We really appreciate all the time that you have invested in coming to join us. And I also just want to say we're very excited to be able to offer programs like this one as a complimentary opportunity for everyone. But we do appreciate any financial support. it does help make programs like this one possible. And I want to give a shout out to our donor who last week donated $100 in honor of this program. So thank you so much, Maggie, for your donation. We look forward to having you all back next week and joining, or sorry, not next week, on the 31st, and joining us for our last History in the Kitchen program of 2020, where we'll be making pumpkin fritters. Thank you so much, everybody. Hope you enjoyed it. Look forward to having you next time. And if anybody wants to hang out, ask a few more questions, chat with us as well. Rachel and I will hang out here for a few minutes. I know Laura can hang out for a minute or so more before she has to dash off to another activity this morning.
I'm a busy bee today. And just as a last note, I am letting this just simmer on the stovetop. So like we said, low and slow, just letting it sit there.
And if you drop that lid on it, Laura, I'll come check on it in a few minutes.
Okay. The broth is starting to look really good.
Can you hold it up and show it to us one more time before you dash?
Yeah, sorry, let me.
Oh, doesn't that look amazing, everybody? I'm ready for it.
So yeah, you can see it kind of collecting there at the bottom.
So
And I
excited.
could put it, actually, I think I will put a teeny bit more. Not going to be stingy with my water.
Cover that up. We'll let it simmer for a little while longer. And if Laura doesn't hurry back from her next activity, I might eat it all.
Yeah, I leave this in your capable hands.